Here we are at the Craft Academy Bootcamp. It's fairly late in the camp, and our students will start building their own APIs to share the data with an outside world. And this week's assignment and next week's assignment is all about getting your mobile application to work and interact with your back end. And the way we will interact with the backend is to allow like a mobile application to access some resources from our database in a way that is very structured and foreseeable and gives us the results that we want to. So there are certain things that I want you to understand before we dive into these techniques. And one of them is something that we refer to as REST and RESTful APIs. I don't know if you ever heard about this before. If you haven't, this will be your first interaction with this. And today we will just talk a little bit about the concepts, about what RESTful means and stands for, and tomorrow we will do. After that, I will be sending out some materials to you tomorrow morning to read upon this, and then we will do more practical stuff about REST and RESTful APIs, right? So I had a set of slides for this talk. Unfortunately, those slides has gone MIA, missing in action. So we're going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to recreate some of this into a short article and potentially some slides that I can distribute to you guys, so you can get all these acronyms and all those all this new terminology in written formats for you to study. But again, today is more about conceptual levels, basically. So REST stands for Representational State Transfer. It's an architecture. And it's a way to describe web services, or mainly, it's also a very popular pattern or way of building your services on the web. And the acronym has to do with how a client and a backend server manage the state of server-side objects by sending representations of the objects back and forth, right? So for instance, if you think about stuff that we can do to an object, like if we have a book, a user, a restaurant, or whatever we want to deal with in our domain, we can do mainly four things to those objects, and you guys know that from before. We refer to them as CRUD actions, right? Meaning create, read, update, and destroy, or delete, whatever you want to call this. So these are the four different things that we can do to an object, and they are also represented by some HTTP verbs, right? We know that the Hypertext Transfer Protocol has some verbs that it uses, and we make use of four of them. There are more than that, but we make use of four of them. For instance, a get request is usually used to show a resource, like for the R in CRUD, read. Like we want to access that and display it somehow, and we usually do that with the GET protocol. You also know that most of our create action done by, for instance, forms, right? When we allow a user to interact with our backend through a form, like he wants to create a new account, for instance, so he has to type in his email and some password and what have you. Then we are sending off a post request, right? So post is often used to create new objects. When we destroy an object, like if we want to delete it from our database in our case, or what have you, we usually use a delete request. For instance, when we want to log out from our Rails application, that request, when we destroy a session, is made with a delete protocol. And also, finally, if we want to update, like we want to fetch some information about, for instance, a restaurant or a book, an article, or what have you, we want to fetch the information, send in new details about it. We do that with a request that is referred to as put, a put request. So post to create, get to show, to read, put to update, and delete to destroy. So we can map those HTTP protocols to certain actions in CRUD. All right, and these different actions, they represent a state of this new object or object, right? So if, for instance, in the create action that we do with a post request, we want to get the representation of this new item, like we interact with the backend in order to make it come to life, basically create it. And the same thing goes for the show, update, and destroy. And if you think about the methods that we get in our controllers in Rails, our controllers when often involve those create, read, update, and destroy actions. And we know that the show action is actually named show. The create action is also named create in our controllers. And then you have the delete and edit or update action that is also very much present. Now, both the create and edit update are done in 2 steps in Rails. So you have, if you examine your controllers closely, you have a new and create actions. You have 2 separate functions, and the edit and update are also tightly coupled with each other, right? And that is just for architectural purposes in Rails, right? So, and there is also a 5th action, or that is very common, and that is the index action, right? And the index action generally refers to a collection, a set of these objects. So if you have a controller that deals with, for instance, restaurants, we have an index action that returns many objects for you, and then you have all the other actions that deal with a specific object in your database. So these resources are there for us to be able to read and retrieve and deal with the things that we deal with in our domain, whether it's a simple, I don't know, article listing that application that we built in one of the challenges, or if it's a more advanced application like the restaurant application that is taking into account various associations between those objects, etc., etc. By passing in certain attributes, we are able to retrieve them and deal with them in a specific way, right? So you can say that REST, this REST architecture is a simple way to organize interactions between independent systems, right? And it's very commonly used. Like most of the APIs that we interact with, where we can perform different things, are based on the REST architecture. For instance, the Twitter API that you guys been interacting with using the gem that we used in our last challenge. So REST allows you to interact with minimum overhead with clients as diverse as mobile phones and other websites. And in theory, REST is not tied to the web, but it's almost always independent as such and inspired by the HTTP protocol. Like I said, those REST points restful points correspond with the HTTP verbs that are used to create or modify the state of the state of the object, right? So in order to understand restfulness, we have to understand what the HTTP protocol is. And if you don't know that, so HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's the backbone of the internet. Everything you do in this request response architecture is done over HTTP, right? So that is a protocol that allows us to send information back and forth at the web. And so just to clarify, what is a protocol? Well, it's a set of rules that determines what messages can be changed. And like the HTTP is used for the communication on the World Wide Web. On emails, we use POP, for instance, and there are Gopher. There are several different protocols, but the HTTP is the most common one that we are interested in, right? So let's think about, for instance, what happens in our Rails applications when we list, for instance, restaurants, right? Olof, what is the URL to the index page of restaurants, for instance? Do you know that?
On the Slow Food app, or like YouFood?
Yeah, on YouFood, for instance. It's a Rails app, so definitely.
I think it's YouFood/restaurants. No, ID right. Restaurants, probably.
No, it's actually just
slash restaurants, yeah?
Slash restaurants. And that returns what to us?
The index page of the restaurant.
It returns a collection of many restaurants, or usually it just says, we just grab all restaurants from the database. In some cases, like in the YouFood project, we are scoping it down depending on the radius of where user is located and how many restaurants are close to him. But what it always does, it's a collection. It's like in the case of Rails, it's a active record association, but it returns something that is very much like an array with a lot of objects in it. Whether it's just 2 restaurants or 200 restaurants, it behaves like an array, right?
Yeah.
Right. So if we would like to have, and that's a GET request, right? We do a GET request to /restaurants, and we get this collection, right? So Nurlan, what do we do if we want to have one specific restaurant returned to us?
You have an ID of the restaurant, and you're gonna /1 or this ID.
Right. So it is /restaurants / and then a number, right?
Yeah.
Or it could be a number, of course. It usually is. It could also be something else, but we need to be able to identify that specific restaurant by that whatever we send in, right? So if it's a name, then the name should be unique, for instance. So we only, we know that it's a specific restaurant. The best thing with passing in ID numbers is that the ID numbers are unique identifiers, right? So we pass that in. Okay, cool. So let's have a look at that in the context of our little application here. Let's go to screen share. There we are. Bam. And we move this out of the way, and we come here, and just let me clear this out of the way. And if we do Rails routes, right, we can see that happening somehow. Hopefully, let's see if we can get this out of the way as well. Let me just wait for that to show up. Right, so here we are, and we have the restaurants controller here. I'm just going to highlight everything. Can you guys see my screen properly?
Yeah, it's fine.
Right. So these are the routes that we are talking about at this point, right? So the first question here was about the index index route, and that is just /restaurants. And you see that it says something about format, right?
Yeah, shit.
Right. And what could that format be in this case? We mentioned it today in our retro. The format is whether it's HTML or JSON request, basically.
So, okay, I've been wondering about it for a while.
Right.
Like, what's this format?
So in this case, in the context of RESTfulness, we don't care about that format too much. I just wanted to mention this, that if we do HTML in Rails, if we do an HTML request to /restaurants, then we will get a response that is equivalent to that. You know, you ask for the format HTML and you get an HTML response. If you ask as a JSON, then you get a JSON response. And just for you guys to see that, I don't know if you've seen this yet. Let me just get this up and running. And Rails server. Oops, sorry. Rails server. While this is booting up, I just want to show you this here in the restaurants controller, right? So here, again, I've talked to you about this before. If the index action is being hit with the HTML format, then this code will be executed, right? And if it's been hit with a JSON format request, it's still a GET request, but another format, it will execute this code. Meaning that we just go to localhost 3000 and what? Oh, sorry. RVM, I didn't switch to proper version of Ruby. Let's just fire up the server again. So depending on what, yeah, here we are. So this is a normal HTML request. And what happens? Well, it renders the index page, right? It executes the code in the index action and responds to the HTML format, basically, right? Right. If we would do, and the same thing is here. The reason why the root path is responding to that controller is, of course, because we set that in our routes file, right? But what we really do is do /restaurants. Now look what will happen if I change the format to a, well, yeah, to a JSON request. So I just type .json here, and the response is slightly different, right? Now you no longer see the HTML page, but you rather get a JSON object back. In this case, an empty JSON object, but still an object, right? So for some reason, we're not getting this user location properly displayed, but it doesn't really matter because it's just for demonstration purposes for you to understand that the request can be made in a different format. Let's head back to our route table, and we go to restaurants index. This was the one, but look, if I do a different format, if I do a post request to the same URL, you see here we do /restaurants, but now a different method will be invoked, but with the same URL. By switching from a GET request to a POST request, we are dealing with something completely different. You see, we are dealing with the create method. Can you see that here? Now, doing a post request from a browser is very hard. So we need to do that with something else, and we can do that using a piece of code that is a piece of an application that is called Postman. And I don't know if you guys used Postman before. I think you did in another project. So let's say let's set a binding pry here on the create method. Oh, you don't even have a create method here. So let's create one just for the sake of this demonstration. Define create, and I will just set a binding pry here, right? And now we just do localhost and then restaurants, right? And I'm gonna change this to a post request, and I'm just gonna well, we're going to do something like this. Form data, testing, test, and test should be hello world. Something like that. Let's try that at least. And we do a post request to that URL. Right, so it's loading, and what happened in our, well, we get an invalid authenticity token. Why would we get that? But you see, well, even if you didn't quite hit that, you can see that we get this restaurants controller at create action, and the params were set to test hello world. You see that here? And what went wrong is that the CSRF settings prevented us from doing that. That's a built-in Rails setting. I can overwrite that, but it's just for demonstration purposes. It's enough if we see the log output. We don't necessarily need to see that in action, right? So my point here is that with the same URL, but only by switching the HTTP verb from get to post, we get a different action that we are dealing with in Rails. If we would, for instance, switch back to a GET request here and send that, we are getting a doc type and a lot of things, and the posts and the logs would tell us that it's all good because we are getting this this restaurant index action, etc. So, you know, two different HTTP verbs and two different responses from the server. All right. So meaning that you can see here in this application a lot of different HTTP words, but we only make use of the get, post, put, and delete verbs in our applications mostly. But there are more, just so you know that. But you know, what you see here as a request is actually the thing that we are rendering on the page with the map and all of the stuff. But Postman does not render them as a humanly readable web page, but only returns the code, right? Okay, so if we would like to modify a resource, we need to closely examine our routing table, and we can see here that with the put request, we can update the restaurant, you know, on a URL that is called restaurant something, you know, and then with the delete request, we can hit the destroy action, right? So I just wanted to introduce this notion and kind of explain, because you've seen these routing tables before, perhaps without understanding what is exactly going on here. But when we use the get request, we need to pass in a parameter into that that request. So it's still slash restaurant slash a number, right? And that number will be used to identify that specific restaurant. So let's just try that. Let's just pass in like 1. I don't know even if I have a restaurant with that ID number. And we have that. We have the Django Fett restaurant. And if we closely examine the logs on the server, we can see here that from here, right on top, you see it started a GET request to the restaurant's URL /1, and it was processing the restaurant's controller show action as HTML, right? You see that because we made a normal request, an HTML request, that's why he hits the show action with a HTML request. And then he does, he recognizes the params. We're passing in ID 1. Then Active Record does its magic, fetching the restaurant, the cart, the dish category, the menu, and the reviews for that particular restaurant, the entire info. And after some Active Record magic, it tells us that he rendered the navigation of the site, and he renders the footer, but most of all, it renders the show HTML HAML, with the information that he was able to retrieve from the database, right? So if you look at your logs this way, they become less and less Greek, but they actually make sense, and they are gathering all the info needed for you to display that, to be able to see that web page in a specific way. Now we can do something like this. We can do one.json. It will not work, but I just want to show you the log output, which is the interesting part here, right? So if we do this now, it will not. It will throw us an error that it's missing a template for this request format, right? And it looked for something that could tell the application what sort of JSON response he wanted. The interesting part is not the error itself. The interesting part is this, that you looked for this, started to get restaurants 1 JSON, and here, this is an interesting line, processing the restaurant's controller show as JSON. Remember, last time it said as HTML, but now the request format is JSON, and it's doing the same thing here, fetching the data from our database and stuff until it hits a problem saying that, look, there is no view for this, so the action controller just blows up in our face, right? So it doesn't know what to do with the request anymore. So this is the difference between the HTML request and JSON request in a basic Rails application. Just by switching the request format and the HTTP words, we can access different state of the same object, right? And if we want to update it and do some other stuff, it basically it's basically a continuation of the same thing. It's nothing more complicated than just modifying the URL. So the key to everything lies in the URL, in the actions that you have defined in your controller, and also about the HTTP verbs that you are using for various requests, right? So again, there are many request types, HTTP verbs in the applications that we build for the web. But as I said, mostly it's get, put, post, and delete. So these 4 are the ones that you kind of need to remember. Let me just stop my screen share for a while. It's not necessary now. Oh, there we go. So The GET request is the simplest type of HTTP request methods, and so the GET request is also the method that the browsers use each time you click a link or type a URL into the address bar, right? A POST request is used when processing whatever you want to do on the server side. For instance, like if you want to create something, or you want to fetch something from the database, that's usually done with a POST request. And when you access the URL, the PUT request is used when you wish to update a resource identified by the URL. For instance, a specific restaurant. And the delete method, the delete verb is of course used when you want to delete a resource identified by the request. So again, it's the same URL. The only thing you change is the HTTP verb. So as you see here in the routing table, well, you don't see it because I stopped screen sharing, but if you closely examine the routing table of your restaurant application, these 4 routes represent the 4 states of the restaurant, for instance, in this case, that are available to us, basically. If we look at the slightly more advanced example, and in your case that would be the restaurant review example, these routes are not that simple as the restaurant route, because here we need to pass in 2 parameters. The restaurant review is dependent on the restaurant it belongs to, right? So in this case, that is represented by /restaurants/1 if it's the Django Fett restaurant, and then /reviews/ and review number that belongs to that specific restaurant, right? So depending on what HTTP verb you use in that setting with this slightly more complex URL, you get to hit a different method in the reviews controller, right? And also in Rails, the controller name is corresponds to this RESTful way of representing those resources in plural, right? Because we always call our controllers controller, users controller, or restaurants controller. It's in plural, and our URLs are also created that way. That is the RESTful convention, mainly, one would say. All right, so the representations, again, we can say that the HTTP client and the HTTP server exchange information about resources defined by the URLs, and depending on what HTTP word you're using. And we say that requests and response contain a representation of that particular resource. And by representation, we mean information in a certain format about the state of the resource or how the state should be in the future. So if we do a create request, right? So we want the state to be that this object actually exists, right? And of course the sequence here is extremely important. We cannot do a GET request for a resource that is not being created yet. We get if we try to do that, of course, we will get an HTTP error message that it's not being found, or unprocessable entity. And once we have created that resource, then we can get it. Once we have deleted it, we cannot get it anymore, right? And or update it anymore. So the representation is dependent, of course, of what is actually going on in our database, or what requests we've done before, etc., etc. So that's about how much we would like to cover in this little walkthrough. I think that we can see that the CRUD actions and restfulness kind of correspond to each other. And in tomorrow's talk, I will be going into more advanced theory behind this RESTful architecture, and show you a way of doing these things in Rails, so we can show the representation of each object, or perform all the CRUD actions on objects, depending on what we want to do and why we want to do that, basically. So this is a very abstract concept, and I totally understand that. But the RESTful architecture is something that you've already been practicing without having this theoretical knowledge behind you. And the step from whatever you've done up until today in normal web-based application format to expand your knowledge and your skill set to be able to build RESTful APIs is a pretty straightforward step once you understand the background technology and the background ideas behind restfulness. All right, any questions on that, people, at this point? Basil?
No, none so far.
All right. Magnus?
No, none so far, but I missed most of the talk, so.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, it will be recorded,
yeah.
So, and you'll get some written documentation behind the stuff that I've been talking about. Nolan?
Yeah, it was mainly this nested resources which were bugging me, but I did this reviews thing and I did practice that, so now it's okay.
All right, cool. And Olof?
No, I don't have any questions now, but I think it cleared up some for me, because I had been reading about the restfulness when you slammed it to another channel. I was like, oh, I'm gonna Google this, but I think I'll just watch this again and take some more notes to get it. It's something I really need to get.
Right. Okay, well, cool, people. So this was a very brief intro behind the theory, and there are a lot of acronyms, the protocols and the verbs and the the representation, the state of the resources and etc. But in the very essence, it's fairly easy. It's about what we want to do with objects. And in the beginning, you guys had issues. I remember in the prep course in the first weeks of the camp to actually just grasp the idea of objects being passed around and messages being passed around. But you already know most of this stuff intuitively because you've done it so much. And now we're just gonna land a bit of theory behind this, and so we can take the next step and actually build applications that talk to other applications rather than humans. You understand? And the entire idea behind RESTful APIs, in its essence, is just a way of communicating in a structured way between two computer systems, right? Like a mobile client will not benefit from seeing an HTML page. It will only benefit from some data that is structured in a way so that the client knows what to do with it in the future, right? But more on that tomorrow. Let's give this a rest for now, at least. All right.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, people.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.